Hey everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here today. My name is Agatha Basilar. I am on the board of the Schumacher Center and we welcome you here tonight. Thanks for being here. So I'm going to introduce the lecture series, our speaker tonight, and then we'll get going. So tonight's lecture series is named in honor of Robert Swann, founder of the E.F. Schumacher Society, now the Schumacher Center for New Economics. Dedicated to the cause of peace, Swan served a federal prison sentence as a conscientious objector during World War II. Prison was, as Bob put it, his monastery and university. Alongside civil rights leader Bayard Rustin, he studied community economics and nonviolent activism as exemplified by Gandhi in India. After his release from prison, Bob's 1960s civil rights work led to an effort to secure land for African American farmers, serving as a model for the community land trust movement. Later on, in the Berkshires, Swan continued his work as a pioneer and advocate of CLTs, as well as local currency initiatives. The Swan Lectures will provide a platform for those who embody Swan's practical activism and who lead by example. Tonight would have been Robert Swann's 105th birthday. As you'll soon hear, Kali Akuno is an inspiring and fitting first speaker for this lecture series. So, Kali Akuno, sitting right here, is co-founder and co-director of Cooperation Jackson, a network of worker cooperatives and community land programs that nurture a democratic, just, and sustainable economy in Jackson, Mississippi, and beyond. Among these programs is the Fannie Lou Hamer Community Land Trust, or CLT, which empowers community members to collectively steward the land and create opportunities for affordable property ownership. They do this by purchasing vacant lots, abandoned buildings, and commercial facilities, removing these properties from the speculative market and permanently dedicating them for sustainable and affordable communal endeavors. Kali has served in the Mayoral Administration of the late Chokwe Lumumba of Jackson, Mississippi, often described as America's most revolutionary mayor. Kali's focus in this role was to support cooperative development, sustainable operation of public infrastructure, and promote the human rights and international relations of the city. Kali is co-editor of the book Rising Jackson, The Struggle for Economic Democracy and Black Self-Determination in Jackson, Mississippi. Kali is also the author of numerous articles and pamphlets, including the Jackson Kush Plan, the original blueprint for Cooperation Jackson, Until We Win, Black Labor and Liberation in the Disposable Era, Operation Ghetto Storm, on the extrajudicial police killings of Black people, and Let Your Motto Be Resistance, a handbook on organizing new African and oppressed communities for self-defense. He has served as the executive director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund based in New Orleans, Louisiana, after Hurricane Katrina. He also recently helped the residents of Jackson navigate a citywide water shortage and crisis, which still continues today. In short, when there is too much water or too little water in the Deep South, Kali rushes in to help. Lastly, Kali is also an educator. He was a co-founder of the School of Social Justice and Community Development, a public school serving the academic needs of low-income African American and Latino students in Oakland, California. As of August 2021, Kali has been working as Racial and Environmental Justice Coordinator at the Institute for Social Ecology, which provides popular capacity building and organizing assistance to social and political movements that aim to reharmonize human communities with the natural world. As Brian Stevenson, the civil rights lawyer and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, has said, "We cannot create justice without getting close to places where injustices prevail. We have to get proximate." Please welcome our incredibly proximate and pragmatic speaker working at the intersection of climate, political organizing, and race, Kali Akuno.
All right, so I'm kind of a largely impromptu speaker, as it is anyway. I try to master the fields in which I'm in to be able to kind of freestyle. So, just wanted to give you all a heads up on that. I hate PowerPoints and things that are kind of prescriptive. So, But my mind is a bit occupied, a little bit more than normal because of what is currently taking place in Mississippi. So on the one hand, I ask you to forgive me for that, but also to join with me in kind of taking some action to deal with it. And I just found out that a tree has hit a part of my own house. Literally on the phone. No, it's all good. Nothing was, they checking it out and destroy it. But we are without power in the entire city of Jackson now. There's no power. Because another storm, you all might have heard about the tornadoes that came through and, wiped out a path of about 100 miles, up in the Delta. They came through on Friday. Unfortunately, the death toll is still rising as they're finding some stuff out. And literally about an hour ago, heard that there was another storm front that was coming through, and it's already doing some damage. So it's knocked out, a bunch of trees and stuff like that in our neighborhood, in my immediate neighborhood, and the power's out, I think, all over the city. So I'm simultaneously speaking to you and organizing at the same time. I won't be organizing from here, from the podium, so don't worry about that. But I will be having to respond to a couple of things, I think, fairly shortly as I get more and more information as to what's going on. All right, I think that is, for me, that's a good way to introduce what I was planning on talking about anyway. But before I do that, I want everybody, I try to dress properly for the occasion. I wanted to note that because I do want to give, due props to the history and the foundation, laid by Swan, particularly on the occasion of his 105th birthday. I do consider him a movement ancestor and have, for quite some time, which is, part of the my own personal kind of attraction in trying to learn and draw from the collective experience that's been, practiced in this community. So I always think it's important for folks it may not be the utopia you want, but do take stock of what you actually have done, right? And what foundations it has laid and what it actually has inspired others to do. So for us, just so folks to understand, we are still struggling to try to how to build an alternative currency to fit into our particular context as a means of first kind of developing a post-capitalist set of relationships to then build something even more radical than that, right? Because for us, we're trying to get ourselves out of having to sell our time and labor, point blank, and to utilize the assets that we have. Where we're at in Jackson, folks should know the real unemployment, not the way that they artificially count it. The real unemployment where I'm at is about 50%. No, not joking. Now you can look at that as a problem, and fundamentally is within the type of capitalist economy in which we're structured. But the other thing with that, there's some pieces which, if you flip that around, we got a lot of people with a lot of time. And we got a lot of people with a lot of skills, right? And we have an abundant level of abandoned resources in our community, which if we could re-articulate its ownership from things that are being privately held or governmentally held, but then held in common, we can do some fundamental things to shift, right, the quality of life overall in our community. But it takes a different kind of organizing perspective. So some of that is what I want to talk about. But I want to put out, some challenges. And starting with that, I think just makes it real on why I was really want to call this like shifting focus. Look, I think I'm talking to kind of the converted, but even amongst the converted, time is short. The climate crisis and all the different kind of spill-off effects from it, like that's more real than I think we are even in our remotest dreams prepared for. And I'll just cite myself. I was one of the people, I've been following the climate science for the last 25 years. Hurricane Katrina was a major wake-up call to me and my comrades to start shifting and start developing some of the stuff that, Cooperation Jackson has become. But nobody in their right mind, I think, has predicted what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 years. And everybody who's seriously paying attention and being honest, following world events, no, we are well past a lot of these thresholds that they've been predicting and what they did the Paris Agreement on, saying, well, we got, another 50 years and we can keep it to 1.5 if we do all these things, but there's no actual way to hold each other accountable, and we're not committing to that. That's what they agreed to. We passed that point. We are already past that point. And passing that point already comes with some severe consequences that are already upon us, but just imagine this kind of accelerating and deepening, which is what it's going to do. So I would argue, beyond the normal boom or bust cycle of capitalism, that, I think is very well documented, we kind of exceeded ecological limits on a global scale starting in the 70s. And the global economy, with all this, lore and luster about the growing middle class in China and Brazil and the global economy expanding, that's a lie. Like, you have an aggregate small number of folks in some countries that are materially, at least by measures of consumption, are doing better. By measures of consumption, doing better. But actual inequality throughout the entire world is widening day by day, right? And we just probably experienced, if you step back and think about how wild the pandemic is and the level of contradictions it exposed. And what do I mean by that? Tech in the course, it was already trajecting that way, but like big tech, big data, like they are now fundamentally in command of capturing all the so-called surplus value that exists, right? So I was listening yesterday to, Friday, to Chris Smalls, and I looked it up. I can't remember the exact figures, but something like during the pandemic, Jeff Bezos was making $5,000 a minute, right? And how Amazon grew in the course of the pandemic to being like just a global behemoth. They're not the only ones who kind of grew in that particular fashion. Some of them which are more inconspicuous than we think. Like, how many people here use Zoom? Were you using Zoom before 2019? Have you ever even heard of it before? Right? And remember, there was the glorious days of Zoom when it was free in 2020, right? And then like 2021, they started making you pay for little pieces, right? And now they have fundamentally a dominant grasp, at least in the US, I think in the European context, over a fundamental means of how we communicate with each other that they exploited in a fundamental manner. But there's also profound opportunities that exist that I don't think we've done enough to really analyze. And so I want to just bring some of that back to what I mean by like a title shifting focus. So I, in 1992, so I'm dating myself, in 1992, I was young and had some opportunities to intervene a little bit in what became, the environmental racism movement, which was really, that phrase and that term was starting to really take hold in the late 1980s, right? Folks in North Carolina, folks in Louisiana in particular, New Mexico, Arizona, kind of really being at the forefront of that, and like the Just Transition Alliance and those things kind of, first round of that coming into being. And so we were being exposed, myself and many people were being exposed to this framework about, well, what is it going to take to end climate change and global warming and those things, right? And the excuse that we've heard since 1992, like year in, year out, from every UN conference, every major thing after that, the global economy is too big, it's too complex, it's too dynamic for us to make quick and immediate shifts. Y'all remember that? How many people have heard this narrative in one form or another? All right, we all were alive in 2020. We can agree upon that, right? We were all alive, somewhat conscious in 2020. What did they do in February, March, April, and May What did the nation states do during that period of time? They shut the global economy down. You remember there was somewhat related, somewhat unrelated. Remember during that time period, they were giving away oil. They couldn't sell it. Y'all remember that? Right? It had bottomed out. The price had totally bottomed out, and then it got exasperated by, the crisis. Then you remember there were ships because nobody would let them in the ports. There were miles and miles of ships out in the Atlantic Ocean, out in the Pacific Ocean. This is before that little accident that happened in the Suez Canal. Long before then, they were just miles and miles of cargo stuff, and they were talking about all the supply chain problems. They couldn't get stuff in because they wouldn't let stuff to port. And so we witnessed this, but did anybody sit back on a general level and theorize what it meant for the rhetoric that they were telling us and had been selling us to a long time? It's too big, it's too complex, it's too dynamic to stop or to shift or to alter. You witnessed they did it. It happened. Now, it didn't happen long, right? But when there was sufficient political will and concern, they stopped it. So we now have to realize all the lies and the BS of that rhetoric and realize with sufficient political will, which only comes about by us having mass movements, things can fundamentally change, right? And we live in this narrative where people are like, well, it's we can imagine the end of the world before we can imagine capitalism ending. I'm like, you just lived through a brief period of time where that was proven false. But you have to shift your focus to understand well, wait a minute, I actually, let me rethink about what I witnessed and what I lived through. And another major thing, whether you're for or against it, right, universal basic income. We all lived through a 1.5-year experiment of UBI. Right? Y'all remember all the relief checks that they gave out for a while and the type of crisis it wound up creating for capital and employers and all the screaming and whining the Republicans were doing for a minute about, no, you have to stop that because people are making more money receiving aid than they would if they were employed because the minimum wage is so pitiful. We all lived through that. So without them calling it that, you actually had a UBI experiment. And guess what? The economy didn't crash. Right? It actually helped rebound it. And they knew that it was going to help rebound it and sustain, the consumption patterns and get the engine back going. So I'm just citing a couple of things about what I mean by shifting focus. We actually have lived through some profound things in this last couple of years. But are we analyzing it in such a way to understand what its impact potentially could be? Like the great sick out, or the last one I was saying, the great sick out, and folks, basically look, I know, number one, I don't think I should be working, these crappy hours and crappy conditions, number one. I'd rather stay home and kind of manage my own time more if possible. So you got more people now just I'd rather not do that. I'm not going to go in, I'm not going to work for these pitiful wages. Imagine if we actually had organized that, right? If millions of people decided we're going to do another form of a general strike on a conscious and deliberate manner to re-articulate what the economy is. We kind of just did that on our own based upon our own, individual needs, but it wound up having a social movement impact, not a directed one. Right? So what we have to, I would argue, unless we have to realize, how much change is actually possible, and a profound amount of it that, again, we just lived through some profound things that didn't last long, but things don't have to last that long. We have to remember for them to have a profound impact, right? To at least provide us a guide to let us know what the possibilities potentially are. And we've seen some radical possibilities that emerge during this period. Now, they want us to forget it and just kind of keep going on, but I'm one of the people no, I'm gonna keep reminding people you went through some profound stuff, not in a negative way. The pandemic was bad enough. 1 million people in this country should not have died from that, right? And that's probably a serious undercount. We know it's an undercount on the global level, right? And still to this day, they're acting like it's over, but it's still raging throughout the rest of the world. And there's, apartheid still basically going on with most of the countries of the world not having access, to this medicine, which was publicly paid for. Y'all paid for, we all paid for. All of this Pfizer and Moderna, we actually paid for. That was all paid for by tax dollars. That they then got privately appropriate, but we paid for that. So the shit should be free, it should be free, right? But are we demanding that? Right? Are we demanding that? So imagine if we had a kind of a left movement that was actually more in position, organized and in position, what we can do in a period like this. And on the reverse end, look, the right is making considerable ground throughout the world. There's no denying that. I'm not just talking about here in the United States, I'm talking about globally. I would argue that a lot of their advance is based upon a particular narrative and understanding of the climate crisis, right? Their particular perspective is the world is going to shift, it's going to get terrible, resources are going to get scarce. I'm going to put in all the institutional inputs I can through the direct implementation of violence wherever they can wield it to keep things in place as long as they can keep them in place. Right? But fundamentally, their long-term plans, if you really listen to them, I listen to Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and when they're talking about leaving the planet, going to Mars, I think it's folly, but I take them seriously, right? And you don't invest that much of your own personal money building, phallic spaceships and stuff like that, unless you intend to really, do something with it. And they have a vision, and if we listen to who was it, Jeff Bezos. I mean, Elon Musk has a whole. Check him out of what he says about why he wants to go to Mars. His basic thing is the humanity is about to go extinct. I don't know if y'all have heard him and really listened to what he says. Humanity is going to go extinct. Me and my rich buddies, we're going to first go to the moon and we're going to go to Mars and we're going to save humanity by leaving this place basically to rot. That's his vision. Jeff Bezos has something I think is a little even more insidious. He's talking about colonizing the moon and possibly other places, and taking all the dirty industries to space to make this planet Earth a nature reserve. I'm not making it up. Go listen to him and listen to what he's actually said, put on record. He's on video. It's not like a big secret. You can YouTube it and all this other stuff. That is what he is thinking and doing, and what he's planning on in part doing with all the billions that he is expropriating from all of us. So they don't plan on fixing this. That's the part that I think we need to realize. They don't plan on fixing this. Fixing it would mean that they would be removed from power, so that's not in their interest. So we shouldn't be begging them to fix it, number one. Right? That's on us as a mass movement to do. But we just need to be clear, they don't plan on fixing it. And there's something about this fascist response that's happening on a global level. It's very much tied, I would say, to the climate crisis of it's not going to change, we're not going to change, we're not going to change relationships, so we're going to have to force this down as many people's throats, and then get rid of a good number of the people who are on the planet. There's been 3 or 4 years of serious conversation in Davos. If you just kind of want to monitor a section of, the global elites with their conversation and what they're planning. They've had a whole series of papers and conversations the last couple of years that some of us have been monitoring. And they just straight up saying there's too many people on the planet. There's too many people on the planet. We need to come up with something to do about too many people on the planet. Who are they talking about? And who gets to make that choice? I'm pretty clear people who look like me are not in those conversations making those decisions. So I ain't got no interest in dialoguing with them about coming up with solutions. I do have an interest in dialoguing with all about you about how we're going to come up with something that to not only counter this, get rid of them, and figure out how to do some regenerative stuff on this planet. That's really the conversation. And that's what I think our focus should be in a context of understanding our time is short because the earth is responding in ways, and we should, it's one of them things, I'm a big science freak and nerd, Like I'm actually thinking about it at some point, like probably when I hit 60, my dream is to go back to school and, be an astrophysics. And I'm not playing with you. That is something I want to do. But the critical piece, I think, within all of this is understanding it's kind of folly to think that we have brains big enough to understand all of the complex dynamics of how 4.5 billion years of evolution actually works. When you actually think back and, like I appreciate science for what it does, but I also understand it comes from, in part, the way it's practiced anyway, is very much embedded in a type of Western arrogance, right? To think like we can break everything down to these like little component parts and then put it back together again and understand it. Like that's the general philosophy of how it works. That ain't how nature actually works, right? So it's helpful to do certain things, but it's not helpful necessarily without some other inputs and turning it on its head to be able to fix the situation. And part of it may not be like, we just need to stop doing some of the things that we're doing and allow it to fix itself. That may be the most dynamic thing that we do. And instead of looking at our kind of a relationship of ownership, say like to land, put ourselves in a situation like we're just stewards and we have a particular relationship to it. And something I learned from some conversations some time ago, like just think about how weird of a concept it is when you actually think about owning land. How can you own something that you are dependent upon? You are dependent upon it. It will do fine if you are not here. Right? Your entire molecular structure is based upon it and its relationships, but you think that you can own it and do it. Like it's just a warped concept. And that's how like out of step we are, on a real serious level, and why I think we've messed it up as not all of us, not uniformly. I don't want to put that dynamic on it, but the system that has been created the last 500 years has done some serious damage. Right, some serious damage, and we have to end that system as soon as possible. And I think some profound shifting of focus of recognizing how dynamic the interplay is, how unstable the current system really is, how the people who will kind of benefit the most from that system, they really don't have a plan anymore. Like you can maybe look back 100 years and look at the designs of the British Empire and in the early days of the global U.S. empire, and you can really say like they had some big plans, like we're gonna build these big railroads and we're gonna make all this and do all. They only think about the quarterly profits at best now. And one election cycle, they don't have big plans. And for us, that's a good thing. That means there's plenty of more room for us to intervene, but we got to be organized to do that. And the challenge is, how do we get organized, right? And that's a profound piece that also requires shifting focus. And I would say for us, and I'm gonna end on this, part of the thing I think we have to learn how to do, it would be folly to say that we want to get rid of individuality, right? I don't want you to not be you, but for us to think of ourselves as individuals and individualism, we have to find some way to defeat that. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that it is a problem that we hold ourselves in a particular way in isolation to other people and other beings and other broad relationships. And that consciousness has to shift. And it's not going to shift easily. It's going to shift in, figments and fragments. But I think we have to be committed along to a process of understanding that we're going to have to do that together, right? One of the things I've been sharing is like everywhere I go, like look around. Like there's nobody coming to save us. There's no, grand cavalry coming from someplace else to fix this. Look around to the people that you're in the room with. That's who you're going to find a solution with, that you're going to have to make. Despite all our differences, despite all our dislikes of each other at different points in time, we're going to have to figure this out. And it's broad democratic practice, patience, struggle, and debate that's going to make this work. That's it. So look around in this community and figure out how you're going to work with each other. That's the critical piece of shifting focus. Thank you.
When you signed in, you got some index cards, and if you have a question, please write it down.
And please come up with questions. I'm much better person responding to questions than just like speaking. I much prefer to do that.
All right, first question is, what do you think of the idea of degrowth, and how can we do that equitably?
Let me say unequivocally, I'm actually in favor of the term. The concept and practice of it is going to be challenging, right? Now, I think I got introduced to the term maybe 8 years ago was the first time I really kind of encountered it. It'd been around a little bit longer than that, but some European comrades, were kind of throwing it out, and I was like, well, wait a minute, like, what you mean by that? And I said, I kind of had on the one hand, I was like, that makes sense, but then it was like, well, who's going to determine that? Like, to me, it's like, that makes sense for Europe and North America, but it don't make sense for all the people in Europe and North America uniformly. Like, what I mean by that, like, there's no way I'm gonna go in Jackson, which is a majority black city and poor as hell, talking about degrowth. It'll run me out of town, right? Talking about, wait a minute, they get to have everything and we relegating us to nothing? Like, that don't make no sense. I ain't gonna support you on that. And I wouldn't either, and be like, okay, what's the actual practical application of this that's based upon equity, right? And I think there's a measured way in which we have to do that. Now, the piece that most disturbs me about how some of its use is being put out there, particularly by some forces, more so in Europe, because that's a term much more in currency in the social movements in Europe than it is in the United States. I want folks to just understand that. Like, I think some of the folks, I hear it, are trying to propose it on the level of like policy and policy advocacy and evade the actual practical dimensions of like class struggle. And it's like, you're not gonna get there without that. You're not gonna legislate inequality away. That's just not how that's going to change. Or you're just talking about being benevolent to people and making decisions for them and removing their own agency and doing it themselves, right? Which then means anything that you give, typically the person who gives has the power to also take it away, right? So it doesn't fundamentally change the social relationship. So that piece of it has to be worked through, and there has to be a broad, deep struggle, I think, for anything like that to come into being wherever it's going to kind of take place. But I can say fundamentally, for me, it's a program that has to be struggled through primarily for Europe, North America, by that I mean particularly the United States and Canada, Australia, and Japan in particular. Like, those are the fundamental places where I think the advanced practice of that needs to take place, and we need to build international movements with that understanding that that's the first particular kind of sites of struggle, as I see it, and then figure out how to be in a broad democratic dialogue about how do we build the social kind of advances and things that people need in terms of healthcare, economic accessibility, which we can talk about what I mean by that, in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, right? That won't entail a certain type of it entails very clearly a certain type of growth, but it doesn't mean like a petrochemical dependent type of growth, right? So that's the piece that I think we need to like really talk about. But I think it's something that can be helpful in the U.S. context because it gets us out of this notion even we have in certain ways on the left about this perpetual growth kind of dynamic. Like that we have to figure out a way to get out of.
Thanks. So we have two questions about Cooperation Jackson I'm going to combine. What is it? What does it do? And how many worker-owned companies exist? How do they come into existence?
What do we do? First and foremost, in terms of the solidarity economy side of what we do, we steward land. And I want to situate that one first, right? That's a core political decision that we made, and it's one that enables us to do a lot of experimentation, like being able to steward land and to decommodify as much of it as possible. Like that is our real anchor and foundation. Then we experiment on creating instruments of solidarity. And we've tried a number of different things. Some of it works, some of it doesn't, right? But within each kind of failure, quote unquote, we learn, right? Like we've been trying to do, for instance, we've been trying to like pull together, we had a name, concept paper, people come down and, teach us the right programming stuff for blockchain. We've been doing that for like 6 or 7 years, and we just really haven't totally figured out the combination of what works, but we've learned a lot. So one of the things that we've learned, like if it's strictly a digital thing, which is kind of what we were initially focusing on, again, trying to impart being somewhat environmentally conscious, a digital thing in our context only works for people who are like under 20, right? For folks who know how to use the technology, and Jackson is one of the things to know in your context. Jackson has an inverted bell curve, population-wise, right? And what that means, like you have a large concentration of people who are like 55 or really in their 60s, right? And then a large concentration of people who are under 20. And what the dynamic is that you have basically grandparents raising their grandchildren. Like that is the nature of how, and the folks who are like in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, they're in Houston, they're in Chicago, they're in Atlanta, and they're sending remittances back. So it's very much similar to like a lot of third world countries in that regard, and how the actual lived economy actually works in Jackson, Mississippi. And so you have this big technology gap where you got a lot of young folks who are very technology dependent. You got a lot of older folks and mature folks. They don't use cell phones. They don't use computers and stuff like that. But they're very central to the implementation of anything that we do. So we can't adopt things that's totally going to exclude a good chunk of who our base is. Like it just doesn't make any sense. So we've been trying to figure out like, okay, well, how do we do something that combines, in this case, how do we do something that would have this digital component, have the kind of blockchain, because there's some other reasons why we want to get into that, like would have some of those components, but also be tied to like the Berkshire dollar, the hard currency like you all have, right? And our biggest piece is the struggle with trying to get a lot of companies to like adopt it, right? That's a big piece that we have that is we've gaining some ground, but then there's the larger political context for us, which we can talk about later. That's been a challenge. So in terms of the other part of the question, Freedom Farms, the Green Team are the two most established, worker co-ops, that we have. Behind that, there's the Community Production Cooperative. It is functioning, but it doesn't do anything for generating like a profit. It's not selling anything, not right now. There's a division of it that we're separating off, which we will be doing like T-shirts and, to kind of supplement the practice now learning. We need to supplement what it's doing. But the big challenge that we've had is since it's a fab lab and you got to go through a fab, that's like 2 years of education that somebody really has to dedicate themselves to. And so we've been learning the hard way, like that's not easy. And we kind of, at a couple of critical points, we missed some steps, right? We launched a couple of things too fast, too quick. And we did some, like during the pandemic, we proved to our community why this is essential, because we were some of the first folks, I'm proud to say that, who started making masks on our own, Like in the middle of where there was a mask shortage, we didn't have that in Jackson because we were making masks, like thousands of them. Like we had the 3D printed ones, which was a limited number of folks. But, we got to a point by like the end of April, this is one of the masks that we made. That this is our it's three layer kind of filament thing. We made this, and we were giving these out free to everybody who wanted one in our community, but particularly to houseless folks in our community who are very central in our neighborhood. If you guys come to Jackson, right across the street from us is Stupa, which is the largest homeless service provider in the state of Mississippi, and we have a deep kind of reciprocal relationship. It's a complicated one because it's like a deep kind of right-oriented Black Christian group. Like fundamentally, we don't agree on hardly anything politically or ideologically, but we are very clear. Like we are there, Cooperation Jackson along this little corridor. We were able to get so much kind of cheap real estate as a starting point because Stupa had been there, providing services to the homeless for about like 30 or 40 years, and nobody other than our crazy asses wanted to be, in that community. They've been trying to run them off, and I mean, when you come to Jackson, if you go there right now, like literally, they've been trying to burn Stupa out of existence for like the last 10 years. So 2 of their buildings have been burnt like to the ground within the last, before the pandemic. There was a real coordinated campaign where they were, the scam that goes on in our neighborhood is, the homeowners come and find typically somebody who's houseless, give them a couple of $100 to set a fire to something. Literally, we even know some of the people who do it. They'll tell you straight up here, I got paid to do blah, 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 from the relationships we had. And so they've been really going at Stupa. But their political relationship is fundamentally changed. We're the first neighborhood they've ever had. They've been there like a lot longer than we have, who've never complained, never said anything to the police, and actually, volunteer, work. We got a good chunk of a good chunk of our membership is actually houseless folks. And, we have a totally different relationship. So we've grown in a deep level of appreciation for each other. There's things they want us to change in certain ways, we want them to change in certain ways, but now we're at a point where we can dialogue about that. So that's one thing in terms of folks understanding like what we do. It's not just like co-ops for co-op's sake or that being a measure. That's like, quite honestly, like if co-ops don't work, I'll do something else. Trying to figure out like what is actually going to help liberate folks in my community. That is what we do. This is just one method of doing it. And if it don't work, we'll figure out something else. So that is what Cooperation Jackson does, point blank.
Nice. All right, this is also a combination of 2 questions. Do you have any stories from your community of people who were initially resistant to a new system? How did you convince them? And are there any common leverage points you see in political organizing locally?
Resistant to a new system. I'd have to ask, yes, let me put it this way, yes, tons of people. But it's not uniform, or why I did this, it's not like uniform. So like, we say we have the benefit in Mississippi of not having to convince the vast majority of people that we engage with that they are actually being oppressed and exploited. That's a benefit in organizing. I've organized a lot of different places, and sometimes you got to convince people that there's really a problem, right? And if that's your starting point, the level of educational work and engagement you got to do can be pretty steep. Most of the people I run into Jackson is like, all right, tell me something I don't know. They want to know, is what you're selling me going to work? That's a different starting place, a different point of, and then in our case, co-ops are not nothing new to Black folks in Mississippi at all. Like most folks come from kind of rural backgrounds where form of cooperative living is how you made it, that's how you survive. So that's not like new, that like you might have to have some new words to be like, oh, that's what you're talking about, solidarity? Yeah, we did. My church did that, and my mom and them did that, blah, 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 blah. So it's not like it's a new concept. It's just like new frames or new language to what people already know. But I think the piece that oftentimes folks want to know, like, all right, if I'm gonna put my time, energy, and resources into this, what's the guarantee that it's actually going to work? And I think we have to be honest with people. There is no guarantee. This is an experiment. This is a risk. And we're doing this to try to change this dynamic. And it may look like this for this period of time. It may look like something else for another period of time. The point is, can we engage with each other and make these decisions like democratically? That is the core piece of what we try to like convince people that your time, energy won't be wasted if you engage, right? And that is the fundamental piece, and then like the political pieces kind of like somewhat comes later. But the other piece, and I think the point to the question, we're in a supercharged political environment in Jackson, and part of our own making, right? So like right now, you know, we have a Republican supermajority in Mississippi that they've artificially constructed through gerrymandering over the last 20 years, like very successfully. Good design campaign, right? I respect it has a bunch of negative impacts, but I'm like, damn, that's some good organizing y'all did to pull that off. You know, you just got to respect, like, look and learn from, like, okay, we have to steal that one from y'all, you know, at some point in time. You know, they're literally, if folks are following the news, the water crisis is really, we've been in a water crisis. The most recent aggravation aspect of the water crisis has really just opened up a lot of leverage points, you know, for the right, far right that runs our state. And unfortunately, there's been an exasperated level of political division in the city on account of differences around some contracting stuff, particularly around the municipal waste management. The city and the mayor and the council have been nastily against each other, and that kind of, you know, was blood in the water to our real opponents and enemies. And then this water crisis hit, and, you know, in the terms of process, there were some mistakes made by the municipality. But you have to put that in the context of not having resources to deal with the situation adequately anyway. So, you know, the city council and the mayor, leading up to the system just basically crashing at the end of August, right? There was a moment, I would say, that they didn't really communicate directly enough with the community about some of the things that were going on. I think to try to, you know, like, to kind of have their back a little bit. I think they were trying to not aggravate a particular crisis and trying to figure it out, but then it just hit. It just, like, so they kind of got exposed on the level, but, you know, when you step back, it's like somebody who worked in the city and got a hard education about how bad the water system was like, everybody in Jackson knows how bad it is, but it's not until you really go to the plant and you're like, oh, like, this is really operating on, like, duct tape. Like, that is what we have. Like, so you'd be like, oh, okay, y'all are working miracles with nothing over here because this thing is just, it's gone. So I think they should have communicated, like, yo, it's really bad and it's about to collapse. They shifted. Antar really shifted after it kind of happened. But I think if he did that before, it wouldn't have opened up the level of political attack that he's now under and the city's now under. But in this supercharged political environment that we exist in, there's a high level of community dialogue and political engagement that we are able to kind of like engage in Jackson. So the context sets a different stage than I think your question, whoever asked that question, exists. The conditions already enable a high level of dialogue. But ours goes back to the first piece. We now have to convince people that we have practical solutions to address the crisis. And so kind of, you know, how we see our role in Cooperation Jackson, we're not the municipality. So our ability to kind of affect things on a structural level is limited. But what we can do is pose alternatives and be an advocate for that and try to engage in that and just try to get people to focus on, like, look, we know now, and we've been known on a certain level, like the government is not our friend and it's not really coming to help us. At best, we can have people in place to inform us and to keep the rough edges somewhat at bay. But most of this we're going to have to do ourselves. So we're trying to develop like an autonomous water system right now actively. We're experimenting, like some pieces we've already figured that's not going to work, this is not going to work, since this is going down and trying to figure out how to do it. But we're doing it. I want people to be conscious of it. We're doing this because it's necessary, but we're very clear it won't be sufficient. Like we're still going to have to struggle with the state to build the overall capacity of the municipality to provide the service, right? And so our piece is first a survival kind of mechanism, but then the second piece is, does it give us enough leverage? Like for me, I keep telling people, like Jackson is in a real existential crisis. Like the city is shrinking. This will probably make it shrink a little bit worse, and if it gets beyond a certain population threshold, the potential of the radical politics that's been put out there to a degree that if you eliminate the black working class, those politics won't be there. People just need to be very clear about that. Like, who is the base of this radical politics? That is the base, right? That's not abstract, that's very concrete. Like, who believes in this, who's in this interest to believe in this kind of politics and why they support it, like that's what it is. So if they get forced to leave because they can't get clean water, that's a rational choice, then it's going to change the composition of what we're doing. So, this is a pretty heightened situation that we are in. But again, that speaks to like what I was saying, like we got to get ourselves in gear. And the thing that we're trying to tell folks, like, look, we're going to do all we can in Jackson, but this crisis is not going to get solved in Jackson. It's not. Like, we're going to need a national coalition on a certain level to help extract the resources primarily from the federal government to make this work.
Yeah, side note about that, I heard that Jackson can't levy its own taxes.
Cannot. But, sidebar, real quick. This is one of the contradictions of just white supremacy. So that is something that's been enshrined in Mississippi since the Constitution of 1890, that municipalities cannot levy their own taxes. Like, they have to be approved by the state. And they did that primarily as a direct response to the Reconstruction governments when there were black people who were running the state of Mississippi for this short little 5-year period. And most of that was very much concentrated in the municipalities that existed there. So if you want to know some of the background history, Jackson has not always been the capital of the state of Mississippi. The original capital was the city of Natchez, right? Which is right along the Mississippi River, when the river was much more prominent in the economy, and the economy was much more based upon the different forms of abstract labor from chattel slavery. So they shifted it for a political reason to kind of put it right in the middle of the state, both for transportation reasons, but to take it out of a certain level of the black community's hands, right? So that's why there's a long history directly associated with white supremacy as to why municipalities cannot tax themselves. And remember, Mississippi is perhaps the leading state over the last 100-something years that are always advocating for what? States' rights, states' rights. But municipalities don't get rights? Why not? Right? And it's had to do very explicitly with race. So this is one of those deep contradictions when you kind of peel this onion, like the arguments around who the system is designed to benefit is very clear and has always been very clear when it comes to like Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. So this person wrote, I saw a video clip where you talked about commitments as an important part of organizing. So you know what to expect when calling on others and what others expect of you. What are examples of clear commitments? How are commitments communicated?
There's different levels to that. So most of so folks understand like who you're talking to, who's up here representing. So my parents were in cadre organizations. Some of my grandparents were in cadre organizations. And they had a different level of commitment to each other and to their political projects, right? To the point where good members of my direct family have spent 30, 40-something years in prison as a result of their political commitments, right? In some cases, it was folks, they're really in jail. They've been in jail for like 20-something years because they wouldn't share information on where somebody else is. That's literally it, right? We want this person, right? And we think we know where they are, or you know where they are. Tell us where they are. I'm not telling you. That's a commitment. I'm citing that as an example. No, I'm not telling you, right? I'm committed to that person being free, and if I have to sacrifice something in order for that person to not also be in prison, that's what it takes, because I've made a commitment to these folks, to my comrades, extended people, that we're going to protect each other, and this is what it looks like, right? So that's one level of commitment. That might scare some people, and it's not for everybody, trust me. But there's other levels of commitment. Like a critical piece, I would say, about building an organization, right? When we talk about capacity, some people just throw that word out there a lot, without really giving a definition. I'm gonna tell you what capacity in part means to me and what the commitment part aspect of it is, and try to make it practical. If I know my house has a plumbing problem, and I'm not a plumber, I need to be in a relationship with someone who has plumbing skills and be able to call upon them when I need them to show up and do the task, right? So within that, there's a division of labor, there's a division of knowledge, the skill, and the capacity to deploy when the crisis is needed. I think we need to build all of our different organizations with that type of level of knowledge and detail in mind, right? And how do we have the skills to serve each other, and what is our commitment to serve each other and the broader cause? That is what I meant, whoever raised that question about like what it is to be commitments. And organizing, in part, a critical part is knowing who exists and what exists in your community and how to tap into it to accomplish various tasks. And also to identify the gaps, like, again, to use this very concrete material. Oh, we don't have any plumbers, but we got a lot of plumbing problems. So somebody in here, or several of us, need to learn how to become plumbers. How do we pull our resource together, right? Identify some people who may want to do this on a volunteer basis, or some people are like, you know, math or whatever, you already have something that's parallel to this, so we need you to do this, at least for a certain committed period of time. And we're going to support you through our collective agency, you know, collecting dues, raising, whatever it takes, we're going to support you in becoming the plumber that we need to service this broader community. That's by analogy, I think, what organizing is developing and honing our capacities to do what it is that we want to accomplish in the world. But it takes a commitment to be like, I can ask you, I'm in a relationship with you enough to ask you, do you want to be a plumber, right? And then if you say yes, then what is my commitment to making sure you have the resources you need to become that? So it's a two-way exchange. It's not a one-way thing. It's a two-way exchange.
Yeah, we actually have a question about that. Can you go a little deeper? So someone talked about, you mentioned that there's a 50% unemployment, and you can look at that as a problem or just see it as a lot of people with a lot of time to support the community.
Mm-hmm.
If someone's not making a living, how can they survive? How do you see that as a beneficial functioning?
Let me switch that question around to whoever asked it. They're already surviving. The question is how. Right? People done already figured out a certain, like, oh yeah, I ain't been employed probably or underemployed all my life. But there's some level of, you know, social reproduction and solidarity that exists that people are already dependent upon, that's just not, again, it's just not recognized as such. And the problem that we've been trying to highlight is that how can we take these informal systems of solidarity and make them structured and formal enough where it's not just based upon kinship or personal relationship, which is the mediation of solidarity. Now, what do I mean by that? Take all the big words out. Let's say, you know, I'm gonna give you money to pay your phone bill because I know you. And that's the reality of how most of our communities survive, straight up. Right, at least the black and brown communities I've lived in. Like, you know, we be supporting each other a whole bunch of different ways. Well, let's say I don't know you, like I don't know you, right? But you need the same level of support. But because I'm not in a kind of direct relationship with you and there's no system to mediate that, you might not get served in the same way that she gets served. We're trying to create systems to be like, whether we know each other at all, how do we direct the needs of all the people? How do we identify all the needs? then how do we direct needs to be able to share and exchange goods and services based upon need, whether we know each other or not? Like, to me, that is the conscious intervention that we are trying to make, of saying, like, there's a ton of skill already in our community. It's just not organized in a formal enough way that it can serve the broader community outside of personal relationships, right? And that's what this broad experiment, like, why it's so central. That's like why we're not going to give up trying to figure out, like, how do we do alternative currencies? How do we, link that for us, like, very, like, with time banking and trekkies, like, we're kind of clear on the elements of what we need, but it's like still trying to figure out, like, how do we tweak it and how do we build the trust, the folks that, like, okay, if I provide something to somebody I don't know, I'm gonna get something of corresponding value on the other end. Like, we haven't totally figured that out yet, but this is what I mean, like, shifting focus is like, we already know this is how the community survives. Like, that is just a given. Now, how do we take this informal aspect and turn aspects of it formal? Some parts of it, I don't ever want it to become formal. Let me be clear about that, right? Because then the state might step in and be, oh, this needs to be taxed, or this needs to be regulated, and then you just make it so that people don't even want to engage, right? So a part of it kind of has to have that informal feel to it, or I'm not calling it that organic feel. That would be a better way, like the organic feel of, the level of community trust. It's going to have that, but there's a piece that we have to figure out, I think in Jackson and everywhere, like, how do we make these things formal enough? And like, we don't have the answers to that yet. We've got a little experiment. Some of it works, some of it don't. It hasn't gotten to the level of skill we want, but I do believe, I would argue vehemently, I think we're on the right path analytically, that we want to share that information with folks so that y'all started trying to experiment and figure it out too. So there's multiple kind of experiments going on, and then we can share and exchange with each other. Hey, this worked in our context. What did y'all do to solve this problem? Maybe we can import that and fix, do some of the different things. So that's why I mean, like, the shifting the perspective of, like, that's not a problem, because people are actually surviving, right? They may not have all the creature comforts they want, but they're surviving. So how do we take that and be like, well, let's make our community thrive, right, based upon the resources that we have. And one of the resources we have is a lot of time and a lot of skill. How do we put it together?
Thank you. What methods do you use for decision making? And maybe I'll insert for personal and collective decision making.
Complex question, that one. Reason being, we've come under, just straight up, we've come under a number of political attacks in the charged political environment that we have. And so there's some decisions, just like other nonprofit, like, it's very hierarchical. And I wouldn't lie to you and tell you that it isn't. Like, so I'm the director, and, like, my job is to protect these resources. So it's like, I'm not gonna let nobody waste them. You can experiment and do a whole bunch of things, but at the end of the day, I need to know every penny that was spent and what it was spent on, and be able to account for it and report it. So that part is like, there's no democracy there. I'm gonna know what the penny was spent, or something's gonna have to happen in regards to that penny. So it's the question to us is like, where do we exercise democracy the most and do collaborative decision making? And to me, where I think our collective is kind of like drawing a line, it's my job to manage those resources, and folks be very clear, you're doing that, and I have to do that because, ultimately, me and the board have to be accountable to the federal government. And one of the things that we always kind of tell people, like we're trying to introduce this concept that we just recently got introduced to, that we're creating courageous spaces. Because we've already told people, we're not a safe space, right? Like, if you walk into my space, I can't guarantee you that. So I'm not gonna lie to you and say this is a safe space. As somebody who grew up in a house that was raided repeatedly by the FBI, I can't say that when they gonna come and when they're not gonna come. When they decide they're gonna come right now, they're gonna come. I've been arrested many times. I'm like, I'm not gonna lie to you about what external forces that have more power than me can do, and by virtue, and we tell people, I always try to tell people, in our community, you also to understand, it's not a secret that this is like a bunch of radical people doing this work. Like, that's not a secret in our community. Like, we don't have to hide who we are in front of them. Like, people already know, like, y'all them crazy folks who, like, we know who you are. Like, it's very clear. And if we choose to engage with you, it's because we choose to engage with you. So that's one element of democracy. But it's the transparency of, like, look, if you come through the door, this might be said about you in terms of associating with me. And you may not want to do that. Right? You may not want to do that. I don't have nothing, if that's not for you, or we need to meet and work with each other in some other formal way, let's figure that out. So the part of the question, I just wanted to answer that question, like, not everything can be solved with, like, the same solution. Like, apply everything to every instance, right? You can't do that. Like, we need, like, flexibility. The question, I think, is how do we maintain the democratic principle in whatever we do? And the piece I was saying, like, about, like that, I wanted to highlight that the piece around the hierarchy is an open conversation with folks. Like, we are doing this to protect and enable us to do all the other democratic stuff that we want to do. I don't make decisions about what the co-ops do on their data. I'm not involved in it. I have my opinion, and sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't, right? But what I can say is, like, look, I can, in terms of what we're allocating this year, I can give you this amount of money from what we've raised and what's been allocated, and we have a reciprocal relationship of being accountable to what you were given, but the rest of that, that's your democratic project and experiment, that's for you to do, right? That's not for me to intervene in my role as an ED, whether I like it or not, right? Like, so it's like, where can agency in different instances be practiced? So for us to answer that question, like, what the co-ops do, outside of anything central resources that is provided by the central hub of Cooperation Jackson, they make those decisions. I don't. So what I kind of control to a certain extent, I'm saying I as the executive director, I control my labor as to how much time or energy I'm going out there hustling for money. I control that. I don't control necessarily, I don't do the budgeting, right? That is not within my control. It's not within the board's control. We do that on a certain extent, very collectively. As a committee that does it, they determine and fix the budget, but then it's my job to monitor it. Like, that is where I have control. Like, okay, we said we're gonna do this, now I have to be responsible to make sure that what we said is executed. So it's like, where's the agency, where's the flexibility? But what is the democratic principle? The democratic principle, we've all agreed to this structure. So that gets back to that community. We've all agreed to that structure. You know what it is, and we all agree to it.
So what specific practices can we engage in within our own community to shift power and organize?
This is a period where we need to get to know each other deeply, broadly in our communities to build as much trust as we possibly can. We have to do a level of, like, real base building, I would offer in this effort. And let me say in part why. I think what happened, for instance, in the summer of 2020 was beautiful. Like the George Floyd rebellion, that was beautiful. I'm glad I was alive to witness it, and all the different dynamics, to have that many people who are not black standing up, in defense of black people. That's a milestone in this country. That's another one of the things that happened that I think people don't give enough credit to what actually took place, right? And the shift that it implies that we need to look at, on a different, like, there's a new day here that happened. That's another story. But the piece that was the shortcoming with that, it's not like it was totally spontaneous. That would be a lie to say that all that was spontaneous. It was years of organizing work. Like, if you just take the whole argument around defund the police. I didn't organize it, but I happened to be at the Critical Resistance Conference in Berkeley in 1998. That was the first time I had heard of abolition being used in that framework and concept. And it was only about 200, 300 people who showed up there completely, right? Maybe more throughout the weekend, but any period of time, it was not a whole bunch of people there. But I'm citing that because that small, maybe 400 or 500 people who first was getting introduced to that concept, now somewhat 25 years later, that became a mainstream demand. So that means that like the education and organizing work that was going on over the 25 period reached eventually, like 200 reached thousands, if not millions of people who took up aspects of that demand. So there's an organizing piece and a long-term kind of trajectory and patience that we need to learn from that. But correspondingly, a lot of that was spontaneous in the sense that people were outraged, they took to action. But did we come back, or were we already in position to be like, we can sustain this level of political engagement, right, and contest, with the state and with capital? No, we weren't. We were not in position to do that. We're still not in a position to do that. And for that, we got to do the deep local work and real relationship building. And that is a part that we are still weak upon. So that's why I'm saying this is a period I really firmly believe, and I've written about this in a couple of different places, like think about a small but beautiful scale to your organizing, right? And build relationships within that of a deep nature. That, I think, is what the next 3 or 4 years has to be about, so that when the next round of mass spontaneous eruption jumps off, and believe me, it's going to jump off again because the crisis is that deep, we will be in a different position where the Democratic Party can't turn it on and turn it off when they want to, right? And that's in part, I would argue, that they did, right? And we're still suffering from that because we don't have the base to be like, okay, I'm mad at the decisions that Biden and the Democrats have made around oil drilling or around, y'all didn't come to bat really enough around the abortion. Like, it's one thing to be individually outraged. It's another thing if we got to organize bodies so they can then be like, no, y'all not going to get away with it this time, right? And there are political costs for you doing nothing. That because we are organized, we are going to extract and extol. Because we're not in a position to do that, because we don't have the local base, they just kind of get away with taking us, abusing us time and time again. So if we want that to continue to happen, we'll keep doing the same thing that we're doing. If we want that to shift, then we better do something different. And building relationships is the first part to being able to do something different.
All right, so this is going to be the last question of the evening before we disband. Who are some of your greatest teachers, and are there any resources, books, museums, experiences, places you recommend that we check out?
Well, I'm not going to lie. My biggest teacher is Lorraine Marie Williams. That's my biggest teacher. That's my mama. That's my biggest teacher. And it took me a while to kind of understand that, given, we've had sometimes a rocky relationship, but her consistency, her patience, her perseverance, discipline love is what I would call it. She definitely did not let me get away with what I wanted to do, but was always consistent about, I'm going to be with you even when you're wrong. I'm going to still be with you, and I'm going to let you know that you was wrong. Like, I'm not going to, my mom don't lie to me or anybody. She's like, nah, that was wrong. You was really wrong. She'll say it with love and patience, but she's going to tell you to your face like you were wrong. And that's a part of a principled political practice I've been trying to put in to, like, even if it makes you uncomfortable, if I really love you, I'm going to have to pull you to the side and be like, yo, your behavior was foul. It wasn't wrong. You need to correct that. We need to fix this somehow, some way. Let's figure this out. That's a deep practice that I think we all have to kind of learn. So that's one. But in terms of, look, I'm gonna bring this up, and not because I'm just here, but because it's the truth, as far as I see it. Anybody who's seriously trying to build revolution in this country, y'all better go read Black Reconstruction in America by William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. Like, on the real. Right? Homegrown, y'all in his backyard, right? That is a phenomenal book that is the basis of the Jackson Kush Plan. I'm not blowing smoke at you. I'm telling you the straight up truth, right? That is the basis of what we wrote the Jackson Kush Plan on. His analysis of this empire that's embedded within that particular work. There's others like Darkwater I would also cite for folks to read, of his that speaks to a particular consciousness and a particular set of challenges that he was trying to confront. And that was written in the right, I think he finished that, my memory serves me correctly, in 1935. I think he started writing in 1932. So it's all in the context of the Great Depression and what that was doing to basically just wipe out particularly black farmers. Like, folks should know there were more black farmers before the Great Depression than there are now, under far more harsh and adverse and just openly racist conditions. Why? Think about that, right? That's part of what he's challenging. And to lay in this foundation of how do we create new relationships, right? Based upon the historical conditions here, he laid the foundation for that. So I'm a big advocate of, go back and really read that. And not that the other part, well, I think it's important to read that now, not that us taking certain lessons from quote unquote classical fascism from Germany and Italy and Spain, all that's important to know. We use that language in a common sense. But the elements of homegrown white supremacy that the fascists in Europe borrowed from, that was developed here. And then they took those things and refined them and put them in practice there. But we don't study enough of the actual part of some of the mechanics of how white supremacy really works here and its settler colonial foundations. We kind of ignore that for a lot of different reasons and just kind of bypass it to something that really don't fit our context. So if we want to change our context, we got to understand our context. And that was a piece I was if you really understand it, you got to go back and read that book. Now, I'm a book nerd. I got stacks and stacks and stacks of books. I was over at the library, y'all can drop me in there for a couple of months and just put me food on the floor. I would be fine. I would be in heaven, right? So it's probably too many to cite. I'm trying to think. In regards to some of the stuff around I think some of the deep dimensions around ecological and regenerative peace, I would cite The Enemy of Nature by Joel Colville, who just passed away not too long ago. I think there's some fundamental pieces in that book which are well worth a revisit, now. I think a lot of the stuff that John Bellamy Foster and them are doing on a consistent basis is very good, to read, relative to some of the same question. The piece that they just put out, I think a couple of months ago, is last summer. They did a monthly review journal that's about the ecological crisis with some of the best pieces I've seen in a while that are really programmatic suggestions on how to move forward, just transition and kind of stuff. So I think they did that it was April, May, that issue was, or May. So I would grab that and look at that. To understand the programmatic aspect of how myself and other people came about designing the Jackson Kush Plan. Pick up Unity and Struggle by Amilcar Cabral. In terms of the pragmatic dimensions of building a revolutionary program, I don't think there's a book better than that one in fundamental ways. And how he was an agronomist by trade. Amilcar Cabral, for those of you who may not be familiar with him, he was a revolutionary who was born in Cape Verde, so he's Cape Verdean, and he was the principal kind of theoretist and organizer of the PAIGC, and I'm trying to, the Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde is what it translates to in English. And he was an agronomist by trade. And, he under the initial conditions, he had to work for the Portuguese Empire. And, he kind of got in as an agronomist. And what he did for 3 years, they sent him all throughout Guinea-Bissau. to study the country and figure out how to increase its agricultural yield. Now, he had another agenda, but what he sat there and did was he mastered an understanding of the context in which he was in. Like, he studied it profoundly, right? To know, like, this is the problem in this village, right? This is the problem in this township. And not from just like, I studied the soil. There's a smaller piece that's not in that book, but his one essay, he tell you, like, I knew what the quality of the soil was before I went there. That was irrelevant. The question is, how do people relate to the soil? How do they farm? Like that I didn't know. And I had to sit down with them and listen to them for years and years and years, just patiently listening to be like, okay, and just ask questions. So the methodology is what I'm getting at, that I think that book for folks who are trying to figure that out is a very good one to like read and get into. That I can tell you from experience has been very, I reference that book in terms of actual practice in my head and thinking probably more than any other book I've ever read. Hopefully that helps.
Amazing. So I have two things to plug, but first let's give a round of applause to our speaker. Thank you, Colin.